You gonna do the lead? Hey Marilyn, how you doing over here?
Pretty good.
You about ready to go?
Yeah.
Let me check your horse, make sure it's double back. Yeah, looks good.
These are too.
This is gonna be a little bit harder than anything you've done before, but I think you're gonna be able to do it.
Yeah.
How you feeling?
I think I'll be able to.
I got a reason.
Questions in my head, I feel them in my heart. Answers I don't know of, I wonder where to start. I gave my will to Jesus and decided to trust Him. He gave me every reason to give up all my sin. I know what you're feeling, I've been there before. If you just let Him in, He'll be waiting at the door. I got a reason to walk the street narrow. I got a reason to fire like an arrow. I got a life that's always worth living. You gotta come along. You feel you should be running, though you know you're standing still. You know you could be something if you only knew His will. Emotions running wild and you're chomping at the bit, trying to work the pieces, but they don't seem to fit. I know what you're feeling, I've been there before. If you just let Him in, He'll be waiting at the door. I got a reason to walk the street narrow. I got a reason to fire like an arrow. I got a life that's always worth living. You gotta come along. I got a reason. I got a reason. I got a reason. I got a life that's always worth living.
In this world of quick marriage and quicker divorce, how do you build a relationship that will last a lifetime? And how do you develop emotional intimacy without going too far before marriage? Let's go to the Glen Erie Conference Center in Colorado Springs to hear advice from Dr. James Dobson. In this presentation, Dr. Dobson gives the blueprint for a successful future marriage, the keys to a lifelong love.
Brace yourself, because here we go again. Are you really up to it? Can you really take another session or two? I want to talk to you tonight about the more common marriage killers. We began talking about that last time, but especially and more specifically, I want to talk to you about the reason that so many people get off to a bad start in their marital relationships. Isn't it sad to think that of this group here, perhaps 20 to 30, and maybe as high as 50% of you will go through the agonies of a divorce? Now, we can't predict that absolutely, but if you just take the statistical probabilities for people your age, it is likely that many of you will experience that. And only about 10 to 20% of you, if the national norms are accurate in the case of this group, and they may be a little different because of the kind of homes you come from, but if they're accurate, only 10 to 20% of you will achieve what is called intimacy in the marriage. That soul-to-soul and heart-to-heart communication where the needs are met. And there is that deep desire that we've been talking about within the human spirit for that kind of intimacy. We have a member of our staff who has a grown daughter who was, when she was 3 years of age, the youngest child in the neighborhood. So everybody was bigger than her, and everybody was older than her, and everybody could run better, and everybody could play baseball better, and and she was just excluded. They let her tag along behind, but she wasn't part of what's going on. And you can see a little 3-year-old who just 2 years before, you know, could hardly walk, and now 2 years later she's experiencing something socially in a form of rejection that's wounding her, that's hurting her. And one day when she was about 3, she came running in from the playground, burst through the front door and said, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." And her mother said, "What?" She said, "Popsicle, popsicle, give me popsicle." And so Elaine went to the refrigerator and opened the door and got a popsicle and handed it to Bev. And little Bev said, "No, no, Mommy, lots of popsicle." And so the mother knew something was up, and she decided to just play along with her. So she took these popsicles out. She gave her 5 or 6 of them. And she handed them to the little girl, bundled them up, and went running out the door. By this time, the mother's curiosity was high, and so she went to the window and she watched. And she saw the little 3-year-old running down the sidewalk with the popsicles and out to the fence which bordered the baseball diamond. There's a park right next door. And she stood there at that fence because the kids had obviously told her not to come out there. She stood there with these popsicles. And then she held them out like this. She didn't say a word, she didn't call or anything, just held the popsicles out like this to the kids who were playing baseball. And nobody saw her. And she just stood. She's trying to buy their affection, trying to buy their acceptance, trying to buy their love. And she held it for a long time. By this time, Elaine's got a big lump in her throat because she sees her little girl trying so hard to be accepted. Finally, the kids that are playing baseball, one of them saw her and said, "Hey, come on." And they all turned and they ran. And they came over and just grabbed these popsicles out of her hands without saying anything to her, and then took off and left her standing there. So now she's standing at the fence with her hands in her pockets, and her popsicles are gone, and she hasn't been accepted either. And she gave them the best that she had, and she was really just trying to gain entrance to the group, and it didn't work. Now, how many people give the best that they have throughout childhood and get that kind of reaction back? Now, it's not just young children that long for that kind of emotional connection with other people. You all are too young to remember it, but in the Korean War, the Chinese communists came in near the end of the Korean War and captured an awful lot of American and Allied troops. Now, these are hardened soldiers used to combat and used to seeing death and destruction. And have you ever heard of brainwashing? You ever heard that term? That's where it was invented. The Chinese communists invented brainwashing with these hardened troops. And what they did was isolated them emotionally from one another, totally. If a leader popped up within the group, they moved him. They rewarded them slightly for reporting on one another, so they couldn't trust each other. If mail came from home that was negative, they allowed it to come through. But if it was positive, they did not allow it to come through. And so what they did is they isolated these guys to where they had no friends, they had no contact, they had a dim memory of home, they had no contact from home, and they just cut them off emotionally for purposes of brainwashing. Do you know that 3,000 of those hardened troops, 3,000, laid down on their cots, pulled blankets over their heads, and died? And there is no evidence at all that there was physical disease. They simply lost the will to live when you cut a person off from that social and emotional contact. It's a tremendous driving force within us. Now, obviously, it would appear that God observed this need in Adam, because Adam was alone in the garden. And the Lord saw him there, and he was sitting on a log and drawing circles with his toe in the sand, and the Lord looked at it and he said, "That's not good. It's not good that man is alone." Have you thought about the fact that Adam had God himself to talk to and relate to in the cool of the day? Can you imagine a person having God to interact with, and it was not good. He needed companionship from another human being. That's how deep this need really is. And so God designed Eve for Adam to fit with him emotionally and psychologically and to meet his needs, but also for him to meet hers. And that's what marriage was intended to do. But it frequently does not accomplish that. And that raises a very interesting question. How come? How come it fails to accomplish what I think God intended it to do, which is to meet that need for intimacy and companionship? Why does it not do it? Dr. Desmond Morris, who is not a believer as far as I know, has written a book called Intimate Behavior that I think answers this question. Dr. Donald Joy brought this to my attention, and I'm appreciative to both of those men. But what they talked about was bonding in the marital relationship. Bonding. Now, when I was a child, I liked to make model airplanes, or at least theoretically I liked to make model airplanes. In those days, they give you a piece of balsa wood. It had some things stenciled on it, and you cut those pieces out, and then you glued them all together, and it made a little airplane, and then you put paper over the top. Do they still have those kind of models today? I think you just get the plastic snap-ons today. But at any rate, this is a lot of work. I never finished one of those in my entire childhood because I couldn't wait for the glue to dry. I just couldn't leave it alone. I'd make it, and then before it was dry, I'd pick it up, and the thing would crumble. And I never finished a single one of those things, even though I would like to have, because I was too impatient to wait for the glue to dry. Bonding is like that. You got to wait for the glue to dry in order for relationships to cement. And what Dr. Morris says is that there are 12 stages of marital bonding that you have to walk through in order for that intimacy to develop. Now, bonding is defined as that covenant between two people that links you soul to soul for a lifetime. It's the thing that allows you to weather all the storms that are out there, and what allows you to survive in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, from this day forward, forsaking all others, till death do us part. Bonding is the key to that. But Dr. Morris says bonding is interrupted because we don't walk through these 12 steps. What I want to do, real quickly, is tell you what those steps are, because this may not be the most thrilling thing you've ever heard, but I want to tell you all, there is great relevance here to right where you are. And the first of these steps, number one, is eye to body. Now see, we're moving through steps of intimacy, and you begin with the least intimate interaction between a man and a woman. In other words, one sees the other. Eye to body. No contact yet. You just spot that person, and you like what you see. You know, you're walking down the street, and the person goes by, and you do a double take. Eye to body. That's first step in these 12 stages. Number two, is eye to eye. Second step is you lock eyes. You see her, she sees you, little spark takes place, jumps the gap there, little electrochemical process takes place in both minds, and there's a little interest there. Eye to eye. That's the second step. I remember where Shirley and I were when we first locked eyes. I can remember that moment. We were in college. We were in the cafeteria. I was sitting on one side. I remember right where I was sitting. She was sitting on the other. And I saw her over there, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and then I got embarrassed, and I looked back to see if she's looking at me, and she was. And she looked away and then looked back to see if I was looking at her, and I was. And so we hadn't talked. I don't know her. I don't even know her name. I just saw her and liked what I saw. And she must have too, because we've been together for 31 years. But she was there, and I began to develop an interest in who that pretty girl over there was. It's eye to eye. There used to be a country western song that said, I was looking back to see if you were looking back to see if I was looking back to see if you were looking back at me. You remember that? That's eye to eye. That's the second step in this process. Number 3 is voice to voice. You talk for the first time. It's the first time you have had an opportunity to communicate. With Shirley and me, the first time we talked was coming across campus about a week after that experience in the cafeteria. And I was captain of the tennis team. I just played a tennis match. It was at lunchtime. There were students everywhere. They were coming and going. I had on tennis shorts. And I was walking across campus, I was going back to the dorm to get ready for a class, and I was carrying my tennis racket. And as I walked by, here came Shirley from the other side. And we'd never said a word to each other, didn't know each other. As we passed, she said, "Hi, legs." It got my attention. A little flirt, you know. I mean, I got my attention a whole lot. Anybody likes my legs can't be all bad, you know. So that was our first voice to voice. 2 words, beginning of the relationship. We had marched through 3 steps. About a week later, late in the afternoon, we had eaten in the cafeteria again, and I came out into the patio area of the college, and there were a lot of students standing around talking about I don't know what. There's just a group there's a bull session out there. And I walked up to this group and immediately noticed that Shirley was there. Now, so far we've had 2 words exchanged between us. Now, I reverted back to an experience that took place when I was 13 years old, folks. When I was 13 years old, it's the honest truth, I promise you, 13 years old, a 15-year-old girl, a cute 15-year-old girl said to me, "I bet you a nickel I can kiss you without touching you." And I said, "How are you going to do that?" She said, "Well, I bet you." And I said, "Okay." She kissed me and gave me a nickel. So it's not a bad idea, right? You win both ways. So I walked up to Shirley, and I'm just kind of chatting and making small talk, and I had a nickel. And I was flipping this nickel, and I said, "You know what? I'm real good at calling heads and tails. I'm going to flip this nickel in the air, and when it hits my hand, I'm going to call it. And I'll bet you a hamburger I get it right." She said, "All right." I flipped it and called it. I called it right. And she said, "Well, I'm not just going to buy it on that. We got to go double or nothing." I said, "Okay, let's go double or nothing." I flipped it again and called it. I called it right. She owes me 2 hamburgers. And I said, "Okay, Shirley, when are you going to buy me the hamburgers?" She said, "No way, we're going double or nothing." So I flipped it again. I won again. She owes me 4 hamburgers. Now she's into this thing. She can't quit because she's going to buy me hamburgers for the rest of the summer. So I kept flipping. I tell you, folks, it's the honest truth. I won every one, and she wound up owing me 64 hamburgers. And she's been frying them ever since. So. But that was, for us, voice to voice. Next step, see, each one of these is a little more intimate. Each one is a little more personal. Each one takes you a little more in the direction of getting acquainted. Number 4 is hand-to-hand. We're not all real fond of the Beatles, but you remember the Beatles song, "I Want to Hold Your Hand"? Like that was some big deal. I want to hold your hand. Well, it is sort of a big deal. It is one more step in the direction of intimacy. It's a communication of interest when a guy takes a girl's hand and they walk along together. So it is just one more step. It's not clearly romantic yet, but it is the 4th step. Number 5 is the hand to the shoulder. Putting your arm around the shoulder of someone of the opposite sex is a little more intimate, obviously, than holding the hand. Number 6 is the hand to the waist. You're walking along with your arm around somebody. Now, this is still not a romantic commitment of any type, and it's not even really very far into the relationship. Number 7 is clearly the first of that nature. Number 7 is face-to-face. This is the first kiss. This is your face against the other person's face. This is sitting with your heads close together and looking into each other's eyes and beginning to communicate on a very different level. This is the first one where it begins to be soul to soul and a little different than the ones that have gone before. Number 8 is hand to hair. Have you thought about that? Touching someone's hair in a romantic way is more intimate than kissing. You just don't do that in this culture. It implies an intimate relationship to touch someone's hair. And I'm talking about fighting and you're pulling each other's hair and all. That's a little different. I'm talking about a romantic kind of caressing of the hair. I was sitting in church not too long ago, and there was a mother in front of me with about a 2 or 2.5-year-old son on her lap, and she was cradling him in a very loving and motherly way. And he had his hand just up here like this, and he was just curling his mother's hair with his hand. It was an expression of love. It was an intimacy. Now imagine me sitting behind her if I reached up. See, you don't do that in this culture. You have to have a right to touch someone's hair because it is one more step in intimacy. Now, the last 4 are related to sexuality in marriage, and I think you all agree with me that God intended for these to be reserved for sexuality in marriage. I'm not going to put them on the board, but let me name them. It's hand to body, it is mouth to breast, it is touching below the waist, and it is intercourse. Now you remember before I talked about the fact that there is a natural progression toward intimacy in people who are together and who are familiar with one another and who simply spend time together. But this is the point, folks, and this is so important. I cannot possibly overemphasize this. Dr. Morris, who is not writing from a Christian perspective at all, I mean, I don't think he cares whether people have sex out of marriage or not. So that's not his point. His point is that bonding occurs when you move slowly and systematically through every stage of the 12 stages of marital bonding without skipping any and without rushing any. That is the glue hardening. That is the process by which 2 people who don't even know each other, who only see each other across a crowded room, some enchanted evening across a crowded room, don't even know each other. It's the process by which they go from that unfamiliarity to the way Shirley and I feel about each other today, where I would literally lay down my life for her. I really would do that, and I believe she would for me. That kind of commitment, that kind of soul-to-soul bonding, that covenant that's there, that God intends in marriage, comes from walking through those 12 steps and giving time in each one of them. Now, what does Hollywood teach you? What do you see in the movies? What do you see on television every single night? You see them ripping through this thing. You see them eye to eye first, and the next thing you know, well, they may have 4 or 5 minutes of voice to voice, and Next thing you know, they're face to face, and then the next thing you know, maybe that same day, they're in bed with each other. That messes up the bonding process. It destroys it. It keeps people from developing those intimacies. And it has to proceed in order according to Dr. Morris. And I believe that's absolutely true. And one of the reasons that people get married and they never really feel that what God intended with Adam and Eve and for the rest of us, those tremendous emotional needs, that need for acceptance and belonging and love and commitment and knowing somebody cares for me. Somebody's out there fighting for me. And when everything goes wrong, there's one person I can count on. There's one person that I know is going to be there for me, and I'm going to be there for her. That so frequently does not occur. What you have is, even in people who don't get divorced, you have them living in a kind of emotionless business partnership where they're just coexisting, and many times in a state of conflict of one sort or another. The way to avoid that, and the best way I know to guarantee or at least take steps toward assuring a successful marriage, is to walk through these steps. Now, something else you need to know about this. Dr. Morris didn't say this, but this I believe from my counseling experience. After you get married, you need to walk through those steps every 2 or 3 days. See, you still need to go through the steps of bonding. What women complain about sexually in marriage more than anything else is that a guy comes home, he's tired, he hasn't talked to her, he hasn't looked at her, he hasn't touched her, he hasn't in any way had romantic relationships with her, and he wants to have sex with her here. And when that occurs, a woman feels used. She feels exploited. She feels, in some cases, like a prostitute. She feels she's been taken advantage of. It didn't make sense. It didn't justify this act unless you have come through these stages. And regularly through the marital relationship, you need to make sure. Somebody asked me this morning, how do you keep contact with each other after you get married and keep from drifting apart? That's the answer to this. Through this process, you develop an intimacy of conversation and understanding about one another. Hours of talking to where you know everything about the other person. They begin to reveal things to you they couldn't trust with anybody else. Shirley and I went together 1 year before she told me her father was an alcoholic. 1 year before she told me the pain that she'd been through as a child. Why? Because she couldn't trust that information with anybody. When you've come through an alcoholic home, all of your impulses are to hide it. They're to conceal it. You don't want anybody to know it's this tragedy in your family. But see, through these stages of bonding that we went through, we began to talk about everything. And she was able, through her tears, we both cried that night. What was it, 1959? I still remember it today, as she opened her heart and told me the pain that she'd gone through. And I said to her that night, Shirley, it is my objective in life to make up to you for what you've missed in your childhood. And I've been working on that ever since, see. But how'd that happen? It wouldn't have happened if we'd have gone ripping through these other stages like they're telling you to do today, and you jump into bed with everybody. You ruin the whole thing. We talked before about the sexual diseases that you exchange. I don't think that's nearly as bad as the spiritual consequences and what it does to the relationship. It is very difficult to bond with somebody when you've gotten this thing all out of sequence through all that talking. Now, I mentioned again in my book, Love Must Be Tough, an example of a song. I like to quote the words of songs because it tells you what culture is thinking and what they're doing. And country and western songs do it better than any of the rest of them because they're so earthy. And here's an example now of the kind of bonding that I'm talking about. This is no great literature, folks. This is no great poetry, but just it's a great illustration. Have you ever heard the Statler brothers sing Shirley Jean Burrell? You ever heard that song? He says, I'm the official historian on Shirley Jean Burrell. I've known her since Lord only knows, and I won't tell. I caught her the first time she stumbled and fell. And Shirley, she knows me just as well. I can tell you her birthday and her daddy's middle name, the uncles on her mama's side and the ones that they don't claim, what she got for Christmas since 1952. And that's only the beginning of the things that I could tell you. I can tell you her favorite song and where she liked to park, and why to this very day she's scared of the dark, how she got her nickname and that scar behind her knee. If there's anything you need to know about Shirley, just ask me. I know where she's ticklish and her every little quirk, the funnies she don't read and her number at work. I know what she stands for and what she won't allow. The only thing I don't know is where she is right now. Old Shirley, she knows me just as well. That's called bonding, folks. That's bonding. That's when you take the time to know that other person. And when you do that and you're not in a big hurry to get it done, and the relationship is moving in a predictable direction, heading toward marriage perhaps, you give yourself the best possibility of it surviving. Now, anybody want to say anything? Yes?
What would the consequences be for a couple who decided to do all the steps real slowly over, say, a few years, but didn't wait for the last 4 until after marriage?
Well, you're in violation of God's law, and I've said it before. It's not up to me to indicate what the consequences are. The Lord has done it himself. He says the wages of sin is death. One way or another, when you violate his laws, when you break them, you pay the consequences for it. Yes, he will forgive you. Sometimes the consequences continue, however. My mother pointed out to me when I was about 8 or 10 years of age that Samson, who was anointed by God with all his strength and everything, and he blew it. He was immoral with Delilah, and he told her his secret, and they cut his hair off, and they put his eyes out. He was later forgiven by God, and he was given his strength back, and he eventually destroyed the temple, remember? But he never got his eyesight back. There are consequences to sin. And mankind has been trying to find a way to beat the system from the very beginning. That's really what safe sex is all about. We're saying, science, medicine, show us a way we can sin without the consequences. You can't beat it. It is a moral law of God. It is just as concrete as his physical laws. I mean, when he says, if you get on top of this building and you jump, you're going to fall. And isn't anybody going to say, well, this time it won't matter? It's a law of God. Gravity is a law. And the moral laws are just as certain. It still defeats the purpose, I think, to do that. Yes?
What role does the sexual revolution play in, the speed at which couples move through this list?
Oh, I love the question. It's destroyed it. See, the sexual revolution has come in and said, all the traditional understandings are phony. Who tells you, who has a right to tell you that you can't do what you want to? This is just some church somewhere, some church leaders that are trying to manipulate you and tell you you can't do this. You do whatever you want to. And the consequences in the form of diseases are now rampant around us. It goes in violation of God's law, and the whole society is paying for that sin. In the back.
How difficult is it, or is it even possible to turn back once you've progressed from one step to another?
I think it can be done. It takes an awful lot of discipline and an awful lot of courage and commitment. But I've talked to couples who have really said incredible things, that they sat down and they talked this over and they said, we don't like the direction this is going. We don't feel good about it. We feel guilty about it. We don't feel right about it. And we're going to do something about it. And it can be done, but it's not easy. Because what happened once can happen again so easily. Yes?
But how intimate should you be with someone before you get married? I mean, because you could have a really good mental relationship with someone as well.
Well, there are people who think, well, it's going to happen anyway. We're getting married in a few weeks or a few months or 6 months, and we're going to spend the rest of our life together, and we're going to have an intimate relationship, so what does it really matter? And we're just sampling the fruits of a good sexual relationship early, and let's go ahead and do it. I don't believe that. I believe it's still wrong until you are in a marital relationship. And I really believe that God will honor you for not taking liberties, not taking what doesn't belong to you. Shirley and I were virgins when we got married and have had no other sexual relationships with anybody in our entire lives except each other. Imagine my discomfort now if the girl I almost married comes into my life and we both have a memory of an event that we wish was not there. You know, being engaged does not mean you're going to get married. It often doesn't happen. And you carry that with you the rest of your life. And you've taken something from her that belongs to her future husband. You've stolen it. Do I sound really prudish? Does this sound crazy to you guys? Let me ask you all a question. Do you believe in love at first sight?
No.
How many do? How many do not? That's interesting. How can you really, genuinely love somebody if you don't even know them? If you've never had a single conversation? If it's limited to high legs crossing in the patio near the tennis courts? How can you really? You know what you're in love with? You're in love with love. You're in love with an image. You're in love with what you think the other person is like. You're in love with the concept. You're in love with the possibility. You're in love with the need. But you're not in love with a person, as I see it, because you don't know the person. Right? See, I'm not saying that there isn't an early excitement that proves to be valid. But is it love? Yes?
Will you define love?
It's really been good being with you guys. See, I have a great deal of problems with the way the words romantic love are used in this culture, because people really believe there is something that you enter into that is physiologically different than the state you were in before. In other words, you fall into love like you'd fall into a ditch or something. that there is this biochemical transformation. You say, am I in love or am I not in love? So I'm not sure that that's really a valid description of what takes place. Love is a decision, probably more than a feeling.
But it's part of both.
Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes not. You think it's possible to love somebody? This is an important question. Think it's important to love somebody and not feel it?
Yes.
I tell you what, if you don't think so, you're in a lot of trouble, because you won't always feel love for the person you marry. You won't. There'll be times when you'll be exhilarated. There are times when you'll be apathetic, and at times when you won't even like the other person very much. That's normal life. So the feeling comes and goes. It's there sometimes, it's not there sometimes. What is constant is that determination to make it work. And I choose to love you and to care about you. And that's what holds you when things really get tough. So when people say, are you in love, and what does it mean to be in love, they usually think of a feeling. I think it's a whole lot more a commitment of the will. Right here.
Do you think it's the responsibility of the man to always be the initiator in all of these things?
No, I think that's the way it used to be. And I think women were supposed to be totally passive and let the man do it all. But I tell you what, I do feel that women today, girls especially, are far too aggressive in the relationship. That doesn't mean that it isn't appropriate at times for a woman to do any of these things. But I do feel that when the culture changes to the point that girls take all the steps, they make the dates, they make all the phone calls, they press the guy physically. When I was a teenager, girls never called a guy. You just didn't do it. Your mama wouldn't let you call a guy. That God kind of designed us that way. He designed men primarily as the initiators and women primarily as the reactors. But that does not mean it is absolute, in my view. Right there.
Are you saying that it's wrong for a girl to call a guy or to ask him to dance or something like that?
Not in an isolated situation. You know, I think you can get legalistic here and you can say this is not the way we do it, and that's not what I'm saying. But when a culture changes and where there is a massive shift in the way the sexes relate to each other, to where the girls become so aggressive that the guys are on the defensive and they're no longer playing the role that I think God gave to them. On a broad scale, I think it's harmful individually and it's harmful in the society. Do you all agree or disagree with that? You know, you can take me on. I don't have all the answers. I just sound like I do. You know.
I think it's confusing because, like, I know that my father and my parents taught me, well, when they were raised, you know, girls didn't call guys and stuff like that. And since them and me, in that gap, it's changed. So they were teaching me how they learned it, and so I grew up learning it that way, and it was kind of uncomfortable.
Did it bother you to have girls calling?
No.
Now we get a little honesty here, right? Do you think it's a bad idea?
Absolutely not.
Those who think it's a bad idea, tell me why. Okay?
I think girls usually are a lot more subtle than guys, but guys are dense towards that kind of things a lot of times. And sometimes if the girl doesn't do something obvious, the guy's never going to catch on, and there wouldn't be any relationship at all.
So you think that the system really it works better when the girl calls the guy?
No, I'm not saying she should like skip being subtle sometimes. I'm just saying that if the guy's really not getting the message at all, there's a lot of guys who just they can't see that at all. Yeah. And sometimes it's okay to do something a little more obvious and get his attention. Yeah,
and I wouldn't really object to that. But do you have the feeling, as I do, that something has changed and that it's not good? Now, don't let me put words in your mouth. Do you sense that girls are more aggressive today than they really ought to be? Yes.
I think it's kind of putting too much pressure on the girls because we have a dance in our town every Saturday night. And if you do not go up and ask a guy to dance, you generally will not dance. And that's how it goes. And now it's not uncommon for a girl to ask a guy on a date or stuff like that. But I think in some ways it probably started that way lightly in the beginning, but now as it becomes more accepted, that it's putting more pressure on us to find the relationships.
So you're expected now to go out and develop that relationship and ask for a date, is that right? I think in some ways that stifles his natural response.
Is there a biblical way of who should ask who?
That's a good question. I believe there is clearly in Scripture. This is controversial again. Some of you all will disagree, but this is how I interpret Scripture. I believe that it is clear that God gives a man the ultimate responsibility for leadership in the home. I believe that. That does not give him the right to run roughshod over his wife's views and opinions, to treat her disrespectfully, to ignore what she wants and what she feels, to make her a doormat, that she's a little mouse and she can't express her opinion. All of that has been described as biblical, and I don't believe it. But I do believe that two captains sink a ship. And when you have an issue that two people can't resolve, and they've worked their way through it, and the decision has to be made, I believe God gives the man the responsibility to make that decision. When he has loved his wife as Christ loved the church, and he has tried to hear her and listen to her, and he's trying to follow God's will. And the guy's crazy if he doesn't pay attention to his wife because she sees things he doesn't. But all of the relationship between the sexes has been turned upside down. That's why I wrote this book, Straight Talk to Men and Their Wives. It's now called Straight Talk, What Men Need to Know, What Women Should Understand. This book deals with the relationship between the sexes and how it's changed and what's going on. Let me share with you something from this book in conclusion, and we'll go home. We've talked a lot about commitment, about hanging in there when the times get rough. And the reason I emphasize that is because the times do get rough in everybody's life, you know. And it has an effect on the relationship. When I was at Children's Hospital, I had a stewardess that came to see me, and she came in with a cane. She was walking with a cane. And she had a scar down the side of her face. And she sat down and told me the story. She was married and thought her husband loved her. She was in a very bad automobile accident, and she'll never be able to walk normally again. He came to the hospital and he took one look at her, and he said, "No way, Jose." And he split and dumped her. You know, that's going on out there. It's a selfish kind of day where I look at that other person as an asset, an adjunct, an advantage to me. And whenever that changes, I'm gone, I'm out of there. I want to read something to you that represents the opposite of that. This is a little piece written by a surgeon named Dr. Richard Seltzer. He writes books on his medical profession and the patients that he's known. And here's the opposite extreme, not from a Christian perspective. I think this is beautiful. He said, "I stand by the bed where a woman lies, a young woman, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy, clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will be thus from now on." The surgeon had followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh. He's speaking of himself. He had followed the curve of her face with religious fervor. I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I had cut that little nerve. Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to dwell in the evening lamplight, isolated from me and private. Who are they? I asked myself. He and this wry mouth that I have made, who gaze at and touch each other so generously and so greedily. The young woman speaks. Will my mouth always be like this? Yes, I say, it will. It's because the little nerve was cut. She nods and is silent, but the young man smiles. I like it, he says. He's kind of cute. All at once I know who he is. I understand and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with a god. Unmindful, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth. And I so close, I can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate to hers, to show her that their kiss still works. I remember that the gods appeared in ancient Greece as mortals, and I hold my breath and let the wonder in. See, that kind of commitment and that kind of love of a man for a woman is so unusual that Dr. Seltzer called him a god. He's not a god. He's just a man that loves his wife more than his own convenience, more than his own pride. And he's committed to her even though she will be unattractive for the rest of their lives together. Boy, I tell you something, folks, that's bonded love. And if you find it in life, you are one fortunate individual. And I hope that some of the things that we've been saying will help you do that. Thank you again for being with me.